This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khanna.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, the genocide and the assault on the civilian population in Gaza continues unabated. The health ministry in Gaza announced that over 50,000 people have been murdered, primarily men, women, and children, civilians. The aid into Gaza, food, water, and medicine, continues to be choked off from the civilian population. And despite this being the holiest month of the year, Palestinians in Gaza are withstanding the brutal onslaught and genocide. Nothing has changed. We're going to be talking about all of those things today, Jamal. We have a lot to cover today, including the fact that since the ceasefire has been terminated by Israel alone, 700 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed. And a report just came out today, Jamal, which was extremely disturbing, that in a embryo bank in Gaza, 4,000 embryos have been destroyed also by the Israeli military. I guess the unborn are also targets of the Israeli assault. We're also going to talk a little bit about the psychological aspects of this genocide, Jamal. We really need to look at whether or not people are becoming desensitized to the brutality and are kind of looking away and not paying attention to the intensity of the genocide that's fallen on top of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem. And finally, despite all of the financial difficulties that we're seeing in the United States, including globally, Congress continues to prioritize military aid to Israel despite the Trump-Musk slashing of the budget, basically laying off and firing tens of thousands of federal workers. They continue to authorize billions of dollars for the war machine. We'll be talking about all of those topics today, Jamal, but before we do that, we're going to hear an interview that you did with journalist Sean Mathews, who's with the Middle East Eye, discussing how the ceasefire imploded and the UAE's objection to the Egyptians' reconstruction plan. That was really kind of interesting. So let's watch that interview with Sean Mathews. It's incredibly important.
That's right, Jess. It's a very timely interview. And it describes what we're really going through now with Israel breaking basically its commitment to go to phase 2. Let's watch Sean Mathews. On March 18th, Israel shattered the ceasefire with a massive bombardment of Gaza, killing more than 400 Palestinians. 183 of them were children and 94 were women. 2 days later, Israel launched a new ground invasion into northern Gaza. The death toll is now more than 700. Netanyahu described the strikes as just the beginning. However, the United States bears responsibility for the ongoing carnage because it's US-made 2,000-pound bombs that have been annihilating entire neighborhoods, killing mostly non-combatants and infants. Joining us on Arab Talk is Sean Mathews to discuss his article for Middle East Eye, How Trump's Gaza Ceasefire Imploded. He's a geopolitical analyst and journalist covering business, security, and politics in the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Welcome to Arab Talk, Sean.
Thank you for having me on, Jamal.
So, President Trump took credit for brokering the ceasefire. He sent Steve Witkoff to Qatar, then Adam Boehler to talk directly with Hamas. He appeared to prefer to want to make a deal, yet Israel abruptly broke the terms of the ceasefire without consequences, shutting out humanitarian aid and continuing to kill Palestinians in Gaza. What changed?
Yeah, look, Jamal, I think you gave a good summary there. Trump put a lot of pressure on Israel in January before he was sworn into office, actually, to come to the table on a deal. Steve Witkoff's trip to Israel and his pressuring of Netanyahu became somewhat legendary in the region. And it seems like Trump has done a 360 now. So he is giving his full backing to Israel. I think one of the pivotal moments that we saw was when Adam Boehler went and met with Hamas. And that meeting was leaked by the Israelis. And there was a huge amount of blowback in the US and Israel especially among pro-Israeli lawmakers and among the Israeli establishment towards that meeting. And after that meeting, it seems like Trump kind of gave up trying to broker a deal, and he pivoted to supporting Israel. I think the crux of the issue is this, is that, Israel does not want to end the war in Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political fate is tied to continuing this war, and Trump is giving him the backing to continue it.
So you write that this resumption of wide-scale Israeli attacks means Trump has surrendered the narrative that the United States can control its ally, Israel. This narrative was one that gave hope to many, including those unsupportive of Trump, that he has the strength to put his foot down when he wants things done, similar to what we saw with Zelensky. What does this do to Trump's reputation as a deal maker?
Well, in the region, I think what he's most concerned about is his reputation with the Arab Gulf states, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. At the end of the day, that is his priority, is to preserve his image in their eyes, because they're the ones with the money and the power in the region. Jordan is dependent on the U.S. for aid. Egypt is dependent on the U.S. for aid. So he really cares about the Gulf. I suppose it might not be reassuring for those who were hopeful that Trump would be more of a deal maker regarding Gaza, but he had a very successful meeting with the Emirati National Security Minister last week. The UAE pledged a lot of money to invest in the U.S. So I don't think with the UAE, Trump is suffering at all, his reputation. In fact, it seems to be growing because the UAE is in lockstep with Israel. And I've reported on that. I think we can discuss that report also. I think with Saudi Arabia, it's more complicated. And this is why Saudi Arabia has the most leverage of all the Gulf states, because what Trump really wants, he wants a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And Saudi Arabia has been really firm that that normalization agreement will not happen, at the very least, unless there's a ceasefire in Gaza. And that's a permanent ceasefire. That's not a 30-day ceasefire. Hamas releases some prisoners and then Israel goes back to bombing them. So that remains to be seen. And Saudi Arabia is the one that has the most leverage on Trump at this moment.
So as was reported in several media outlets, including Israeli ones, Netanyahu's goal, and you've mentioned that, was to prolong the war, and many have accused him of sacrificing the hostages for his political career. He was loath to sign on to and then implement the first phase of the ceasefire for many reasons. Talk about them.
Yeah, basically, I'm sure your listeners know this because they follow the region. Netanyahu faces a trial in Israel. And basically, the one way that he has been able to defer his judgment day in the court of law in Israel for Israelis is by continuing this war with the continued excuse that, Israel's sitting prime minister cannot go into a corruption case when his country is at war. So the longer this war goes on, it's pretty simple, actually. The better for Netanyahu, right? Because he keeps to get a perpetual deferment of his case. And that's his vested interest in seeing this war continue. I think, you mentioned that Trump and Witkoff especially had put pressure on Netanyahu to agree to the first phase of the ceasefire in January. I would say that is true, Jamal, but I think it's important to note Israeli public opinion here, which is what Netanyahu cares about, and he cares about his base and preserving his power, right, at the end of the day. The first phase of the ceasefire was somewhat popular in Israel. Remember, the first phase of the ceasefire led to the release of noncombatants, women, some children, elderly. And I think a broad swath of Israeli society was supportive of that ceasefire. So experts, diplomats, Arab diplomats in the region said the real test for the ceasefire was always going to be phase 2, right? Because that's when, the release of, women and children who were in Gaza, those captives ended. And the only ones who are really left now the living captives in Gaza, are Israeli males of military age, most of them serving in the IDF. So Netanyahu has more cards to play here because, wagering with their lives is a little bit less politically risky for him than the lives of women and children. And I think that's what we're seeing, too, at the end of the day. It's a cold-hearted calculation by Netanyahu about how much political leverage he has and how much he can risk with the Israeli public that's in favor of a ceasefire.
So you think that the Israeli public will be more forgiving if their soldiers don't come back?
Well, Jamal, a lot of people said maybe Netanyahu would take a hit for dropping out of the ceasefire agreement. But in fact, what we've seen in Israel is Netanyahu shoring up his political support by resuming the war. His coalition has expanded. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the radical extremist settler, a member of Netanyahu's government who left after the ceasefire was agreed in January. He rejoined the government. And Netanyahu's coalition is actually now more shored up. So if anything, Netanyahu can rest assured that the war is popular, at least with his base and his political supporters in Israel.
Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz is threatening to annex parts of Gaza and gave a chilling warning to Palestinians there to leave or face destruction. With 90% of Gaza already demolished, people starving, hospitals destroyed, there is no evident strategic gain for Israel in continuing to bomb civilians. Is this just another move to exterminate or ethnically cleanse those Palestinians who are still living?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is just more Israeli pressure. I think what Israel really wants, the members of Israel's government, is a forced displacement of Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip at the end of the day. I think that is their goal. And the more heavy bombing that we see that you've described very clearly to listeners, that in the Israeli establishment that is close to Netanyahu and those who are for pro-forced displacement of Palestinians, that's the way to achieve that. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Let's talk about some proposals here. Egypt put forward a $53 billion reconstruction plan for Gaza, which is conditioned on Hamas having no involvement in its future administration, but Israel rejected it outright. Trump seemed more receptive. What role do you think this had in the resumption of Israel's attacks on Gaza? Is it a race to prevent Palestinians from securing a future there?
I think so, Jamal. And you mentioned the plan. I don't think enough people have read the plan in detail to see what Egypt proposed and what the Arab League endorsed. You left out that element, I think. Remember, this is the Arab League's officially endorsed plan now, right? It calls for a lot of things that Israel is going to be loath to support. For one, it calls for UN peacekeepers potentially to be deployed to Gaza and the occupied West Bank. It doesn't say that they should be deployed, but it says that this process will start and we can discuss a deployment of UN peacekeepers. Israel is not going to want to internationalize the conflict in any way. I think your listeners, they know that. It also talks about big infrastructure projects, Jamal, like reconstructing Gaza's airport, reconstructing the port, all of these things that would be actually beneficial if an independent Palestinian state was created one day, right? You need a port, you need an airport. So I think it was pretty much a no-brainer that Israel, which has rejected flat out a two-state solution, was going to reject that plan. I think the Trump administration's positioning is more interesting to a degree. You mentioned that Trump was receptive. We've seen mixed signals from the Trump administration. They haven't come out and endorsed the Arab League plan. That's in keeping with Trump's kind of framing of himself as a deal maker, right? He doesn't want to say, yes, this is the plan that I want. But his envoy, Steve Witkoff, said that it was the basis for reconstruction discussions. And I think that's what Egypt and Jordan kind of took some comfort in. I think the most interesting case here, though, are the divisions within the Arab world over that plan. And that's something that people should be aware about, because that's where the real story is. The Arab world right now cannot put a united face on this plan, despite the Arab League's endorsement. The UAE is against this plan. They are trashing it with the Trump administration. They are trashing it in the Middle East. So Israel feels reassured that it has Emirati support to continue the war. And the U.S. is kind of trying to feel out, I think, everyone to see how it can make the best deal. I mean, that's what Trump wants at the end of the day. He wants a deal. He wants to put his label on something and get it done.
Well, you talk about the lack of political will from Arab countries to pressure the U.S., thus Israel, to negotiate peace. And you mentioned the UAE, which is opposing Egypt's reconstruction plan. What are their reasons?
The crux of the dispute, Jamal, is what the UAE would say, and this is what detractors of the Egyptian plan who do not like Hamas would say, is that it does not provide a clear roadmap for disarming Hamas. And this is the real dispute between the Arab states, Jamal, which is that countries like Egypt, others in the Gulf region, believe that Hamas has to be part of the political process in some way because it's an ideology. It is seen by many as the legitimate resistance force within Palestinian political movement. And they say, okay, we need to somehow have some Hamas elements in this plan. I mean, Egypt is no friend of Hamas. I think your listeners know that. It led a campaign to crush the Muslim Brotherhood after the Arab Spring. But Egypt is more receptive. It's more pragmatic, I would say, to finding some way to work with Hamas. The UAE sees this as an opportunity to end Hamas once and for all. At least that's what their logic is, and that Israel should keep going at it. So I think that's the real crux of the dispute at the end of the day, Jamal. It is the Arab states are divided over what do they do with Hamas, and that's why they can't put a unified front together.
You wrote about a recent White House dinner where Trump hosted UAE's national security advisor and tech investor Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed. The focus was on advancing infrastructure and AI investment cooperation with the US, with no mention of Gaza. How much influence does the UAE's position have on US foreign policy?
I think the UAE has a lot of influence on Gaza because it's the UAE who Trump wants to foot the bill for the reconstruction. UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. I mean, those are the states that the U.S. envisions paying for this. The U.S. certainly isn't going to make Israel pay for this. I think your listeners know that, and you know that. The U.S. isn't going to pay for the reconstruction. So it needs Emirati money, it needs Qatari money, and it needs Saudi money to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza. So those three countries have outsized influence over the fate of Gaza. And that's what Trump wants. I mean, he wants Arab Gulf state buy-in for any post-war plan in Gaza. But I think Sheikh Tahnoun's visit is interesting because the official readouts of his visit didn't even mention Gaza, right? That's a real signal. The story that I did reported that the UAE was trashing the Egyptian Arab League plan behind the scenes, and that story came out before Sheikh Tahnoun's visit. I think his visit and the lack of any commentary on Gaza or the war is a reaffirmation for people who are reading the tea leaves here to say, yeah, there's some serious divisions here between the UAE and its Gulf neighbors, because the UAE didn't even take the opportunity to discuss Gaza in its official readout of the meeting with Trump.
Anything on, in addition to this, I was reading on March 14th, leaders of Israel's settler movement met with the UAE officials to discuss future economic and other cooperation. Does this also underscore the lack of unity amongst Arab countries vis-a-vis Palestine?
I think for sure it does, Jamal. Yeah, I don't think UAE wants to show any daylight with Israel at this time. Like I said, the big pivot player here, Jamal, is Saudi Arabia, because Donald Trump wants a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And it is Saudi Arabia that has the most leverage with the Trump administration, because they have what he covets, right? And they can give him a big win if they choose to do so. So that's the key country here. And Saudi has been, it's been much more critical of Israel. Remember this, Jamal. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he accused Israel of committing a genocide publicly. So he has a big mountain to climb in order to move his people towards a normalization agreement now. He'd have to find some way to justify normalizing with the country that he has publicly accused of genocide against the Palestinians. Those are his words, they're not mine. I mean, he said it. So that's really the crux of this issue at this stage for Trump, is what does he have to give Saudi Arabia? What does Saudi Arabia need to get this normalization agreement? And I think Saudi Arabia has been very clear that they will not even start serious discussions about normalization unless there's a permanent ceasefire in Gaza.
Well, the big prize is Saudi Arabia, both politically and economically. And it seems that, at least so far, what Trump has started has not been working. I don't know how is this if this has any effect on the Middle East. For example, his sanctions are backfiring. I mean, would that make a deal with Saudi Arabia more important than it is now?
I think for Trump, the deal with Saudi Arabia has always been important, Jamal. I mean, that's what he wanted during his first administration, and that's what he wants now. I mean, he wants to be the guy that delivered that agreement at the end of the day. That's his key goal. And if you listen to guys like Steve Witkoff, his closest advisors, they say that publicly. I'm not saying anything your readers don't know, but I'm saying that I think when we think about the conflict in Gaza and where the Arab world is and who Trump is going to listen to most, at the end of the day, it may potentially be Saudi Arabia, right? Because, I mean, UAE has already normalized. Qatar is not going to move towards normalization. It's Saudi Arabia that has the most leverage with Trump because they're the most swayable right now. And they've also taken a pretty firm stance. I mean, they have been more supportive of the Arab League plan than the UAE for sure. And I think Saudi Arabia, remember, Jamal, before this war in Gaza started, Saudi Arabia hosted the leaders of Hamas before 7th of October. So Saudi Arabia is moving to patch up some ties with Hamas. They're much more pragmatic. They're more closer to the way Egypt is approaching this issue, unlike the UAE. And that's the country to watch. I mean, in terms of the sanctions, you brought up. I think you're regarding the Iranian sanctions on Iran, or
Well, you have the sanctions on Iran, and then you have the tariff issues, and all these different plans that he's coming with. They are basically not working, at least from the standpoint of the American public here.
yeah, I don't think in the Arab. I mean, I cover the Middle East. Thankfully I don't cover the American public. I don't try to guess public opinion in America. I cover the region. I think from the Middle East perspective, what they're watching is Iran. And you're right. Trump's sanctions on Iran, he's starting to ratchet them up. Iranian oil is still flowing to China. But again, here's the real crux of the issue, Jamal. Also, right? It's the Iranian nuclear deal, and for right or wrong, whether you agree with this or not, the Trump administration sees it this way, which is that an Iranian nuclear deal would probably solve this issue in Gaza, they believe, one way or another. They see that as the be-all, end-all at this stage. And the Gulf states are watching that also. I mean, that's how they see it, right? They say we get a deal with Iran, and then all these other kind of pieces come into line for our policy objectives. That's how they see it. And I think that's what we should keep an eye on going into the future. Remember, Trump has given Iran a 2-month deadline to either start talks, or we will see serious pressure from Israel and its supporters to launch preemptive strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities.
I mean, this is what Netanyahu wants. I don't think he's looking forward to see a deal between the United States and Iran. He'd rather see the United States attack Iran.
100% Jamal. And that's why I'm saying that, especially when we look at the ceasefire in Gaza, right? I mean, I don't know how Iran should take this. They can be reassured from Trump's behavior in January when he cracked the whip on Netanyahu and he pulled the deal together. But I think Iran's going to look at the last couple of weeks here, in which the U.S. has given Israel free rein in Gaza, as a source of concern, because Trump has not been willing to apply pressure on Israel regarding Gaza. So if he's not willing to do it in Gaza, is he going to be willing to do it with an Iranian nuclear deal? That's what they're going to be asking themselves in Tehran.
You've mentioned U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. I read recently that he presented what they call a bridge plan, which aims to extend the ceasefire through April beyond Ramadan and Passover festivities. Do you have any more information about this, or is this a no-go?
This is look. Maybe Hamas, look, at the end of the day, Jamal, this was the situation. The U.S. struck a 3-part ceasefire agreement in January. The first phase ended, and Hamas wanted to move on to stage 2 discussions about a permanent cessation of hostilities. Israel didn't want to do it. So we had this kind of period of a few weeks where Israel was laying siege to Gaza again, cutting off electricity, cutting off water, cutting off aid, trying to pressure Hamas basically to release the hostages that were still living there without getting what it wanted, which is a permanent ceasefire at the end of the day, right? That's what happened. So the U.S. bridging proposal is really an Israeli bridging proposal. I mean, it's Hamas releases the hostages without a permanent cessation of hostilities, which is what Israel wants at the end of the day. It was Hamas was ready to move into phase 2 discussions about a permanent ceasefire. It was Israel that didn't want to move into it. You know that, and your listeners know that. So I think this bridging proposal, could Hamas agree to it? They could. Not because they want to, but because Israel is pummeling the Gaza Strip, and there is no check on Israeli behavior. So, the real question is, for Israel's perspective, just through cold calculations here, we're discussing now, is that, is Hamas so desperate for a reprieve that it will release the only card that it has left in order to get some kind of relief from this Israeli bombing? And that's what Israel wants at the end of the day. It wants to take back its hostages and maintain the freedom of ability to restart bombing Gaza when it wants.
I mean, do you believe that if Hamas releases the hostages with no conditions, that Israel will leave, or are they going to stay or permanently stay there?
I mean, Israel's goal, which I think we have seen has not been successful, right, is the elimination of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is still in the Gaza Strip. And even if the hostages get released, Hamas will still be in the Gaza Strip. So I don't know. If Israel's goal is to eliminate Hamas, whether the hostages are released or not, they're going to have to stay in Gaza, right? Unless they change their goal.
Sean Mathews, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thank you, Jamal, for having me on. It was a pleasure.
That's the voice in the face of Sean Mathews with the Middle East Eye, discussing how the ceasefire proposal imploded basically behind the scenes. And as we've talked about so many times on this show, Jamal, it seems like the UAE is playing a really dirty game behind the scenes, right? They came out actively against the Egyptian and the Arab League proposal for how to manage Gaza after the ceasefire, but it seems like the UAE has no interest in a ceasefire right now.
Well, actually, Sean and I talked about that, and basically, they pretty much think the same way Benjamin Netanyahu is thinking. They want a complete destruction of Hamas. They don't want, for whatever reason, Egypt taking care of the construction. I can only guess because of the UAE involvement in constantly building cities and buildings, and they want the business. Maybe they want to partner with Trump. Maybe they are part of the Trump vision of the Riviera that they build together, they finance, and Trump will build and keep the Egyptians out. So there are a lot of guesses, even though you have to the Egyptians' plan was endorsed by the Arab League, and which is very important. It wasn't just the Egyptians' plan. That was endorsed by the Arab League, and Saudi Arabia endorsed it, and other countries. But we'll talk about this later on. But back again, just this past week, we've seen one of the biggest carnages, I would say carnage, if you just cannot look at these pictures without crying, basically.
It's so devastating.
Children dead, children beneath rubble, children getting amputated without anesthesia, and so forth. So, as you've mentioned, more than 700 Palestinians, including 200 children, have been killed, basically in just few days. And today, the official number, that's why I said the official number of the Palestinians killed in Gaza exceeded 50,000. Now, the non-official number, as we've reported on it, and was reported by many organizations, that could be more than 150,000, right?
Exactly.
But at least the official number has exceeded 150,000, where Israel basically carried out airstrikes on civilians and on hospitals, and they destroyed the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital in Gaza in the Netzarim corridor, where they described as limited ground operation. And the carnage is continuing, and I don't see an end in sight, and that's what basically pleased former Itamar Ben-Gvir to rejoin the government, because that was his condition,
right,
to not stop the war. So that tells you how sick this government is, that it's not about the hostages. It's never been about the hostages. It's just like a ploy. And what Benjamin Netanyahu is just to keep that perpetual war on Gaza, to keep himself out of courts, and to please his coalition, the likes of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich.
Well, I think that's the analysis that we've been kind of been framing our analysis and discussion for a very long time, Jamal, and even before October of 2023. And I think even Israelis are beginning to open their eyes to this painful reality that Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing extremist, government have no intention whatsoever of saving the hostages, have no intention whatsoever to stop the carnage and the kind of grotesque genocide that's happening in Gaza right now, with basically babies being blown to pieces right before everybody's eyes, in the middle of Ramadan, I might add, in the middle of the holiest month for Muslims in the world. So, given that we have a new political reality where we have a president of the United States who has said basically Netanyahu has full, opportunity to do whatever he wants. There are no constraints over Benjamin Netanyahu. He does not listen to the EU. He does not listen to the United Nations. He does not listen to the ICC or the ICJ. He doesn't even listen to his own constituency. It is painfully obvious and clear to all of us who've been monitoring this situation and looking at it for a very long time. The intention here is to wipe out the civilian population in Gaza completely and unequivocally. This is part of the Trump plan to remove all Palestinians from Gaza and to basically destroy humanity on the ground. And I might add, Jamal, it's very clear to many people, including Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem, they're not going to stop in Gaza. We know, for example, in the West Bank right now is under total lockdown, and homes are being destroyed throughout Palestinian villages, especially in the north. The situation is very bleak right now, and given what's happening in domestic politics here in the United States, where there is a economic kind of bloodletting going on right now with tens of thousands of people losing their job within the federal system, people, and this gets to our other topic today, people are like not even paying attention to what's happening right now in Gaza. So I'm afraid that this is a very bleak and horrific time. And the number of children right now that are starving to death and being killed on the ground in Gaza is unlike anything we've ever seen in the modern era. And what is the world doing, Jamal? I mean, what we have to ask this very difficult and painful question: is the world doing anything? And the unfortunate, difficult answer is that no one's doing anything. That basically Palestinians are being slaughtered in Gaza, and no one is doing anything about it. It's very bleak right now, Jamal.
Well, Jess, we don't even have updated figures. I mean, things are happening so fast. So when I try to look up for figures about what's going on now, and that's why I just say with a grain of salt that 50,000 people have died, but we know the figures are far more,
so much more
than this. And so I was like looking around about like the situation with children, and the latest report is like from the World Health Organization, and the report is from September 2024. They haven't updated the new figure.
6 months ago.
Where they showed 22,500 people in Gaza. Like they're talking about, because we're talking about people getting desensitized about images and pictures of children being, pulled from beneath the rubble, and the injuries. They're talking about 22,500 people sustained life-altering injuries, basically, since October 7, 2023, and that's from September 2024. So you could look at this figure and maybe quadruple it to come up with a new figure. And they're talking about severe limb injuries, amputation, spinal cord trauma, traumatic brain injuries, and major burns. So when they're talking about these injuries, these people are not going to make it, a lot of them with spinal cord trauma and traumatic brain injuries and so forth. And then you're talking about aid agencies, medical organizations. I looked around, they're reporting that more than 10 children were losing one or two limbs every single day in Gaza, and many were undergoing the operation without anesthesia, and many of these limbs could have been saved had the healthcare system not been completely decimated. Can you believe that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can believe it, Jamal, because I've been able to speak with a lot of the doctors and nurses who have been to Gaza, who have been in the emergency medical facilities, who actually witnessed with their own eyes an attempt to save children with their own hands, the brutality of the injuries that are being inflicted on children and babies in Gaza. And I have to tell you, the doctors and the nurses who are coming back from Gaza all say the same thing. They have never, ever, ever in their medical careers ever seen such brutality and grotesque kind of injuries. And we're talking about emergency room physicians who've worked in, cities and trauma centers, where they're is, violence on a regular basis, but they come back not only traumatized, but shaking their heads in disbelief, basically saying, we've never seen anything like this in terms of the extent and the brutality of the injuries that children, adults, men, women, and children are experiencing right now. And I might add also, Jamal, they also always tell me the same thing in their weeks and months of ministering to the injuries and the sick and the maimed who come into these emergency facilities. They all say the same thing. These are civilians. There's no evidence whatsoever of a non-civilian population that are coming into these clinics and hospitals, these emergency spaces, to get any care. So it's clear, that the Israeli military and its government under Benjamin Netanyahu and their right-wing extremist group is full intent is to just create this kind of living hell for everybody in Gaza right now. So, we're going to continue to report about this. And we know that the world has turned its back on Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem. People, are not paying attention to this. Jamal, they're barely able to say anything about what Musk and Trump are doing to decimate the democracy that we have, the so-called democracy that we have in this country. And I mean, the idea that somehow large numbers of people are going to stand up and say, stop the genocide, I don't see it happening. So Benjamin Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, the whole group of them have free reign to just continue this unabated. And, 40,000 Israelis were protesting yesterday, Jamal, bring the hostages home. I think a little delusional. There's no hostages coming home. Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't care about hostages. He doesn't care about men, women, and children being slaughtered in Gaza. So I think we're headed for ongoing bleakness and devastation. And it seems like even the Israeli populace who is wanting to bring an end to this war has no say in it whatsoever.
So, in December, the UN said that Gaza has the highest number of child amputees per capita in the world. I mean,
yeah.
So I want to ask you a question because that if this has to do with the people's psyche and mentality and so forth. We talked about people getting desensitized. You see these images are not now, especially that more people are relying on social media. And, they see these images, they see the children, they see the carnage, they see the destruction, yet it's not moving them. I mean, it's moving some, but it's not moving the rest of the world to take a stand to stop the carnage. What's behind this?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Jamal, and we could spend hours on that. I would say that the brief reason is this pretty dramatic shift that we're seeing globally right now, where people do not feel connected as global or national citizens to their governments to be able to do anything. I mean, people feel, I could speak to that, and we could speak to it directly here in the United States. People object to all the firings and the devastation that's being taken to the federal government, but they don't know what to do about it. I mean, even the judiciary here in the United States, judges, appellate courts, who are trying to put a stop to this. Trump and his team continue full steam ahead, and they're basically saying, "Damn the judicial system, damn the checks and balances. We're going to continue dismantling the federal government. We're going to dismantle federal programs. We're going to dismantle everything we know about our democratic systems of checks and balances." So I think people, and this is what I hear from people, they don't know what to do. Do they go in the streets? Well, if they go in the streets, they run the risk. If they're a green card holder or here on a student visa, they run the risk of being deported and detained. So I think there's one thing, there's desensitization. Of course, people are just overwhelmed and don't know, are not feeling so much anymore. But I also think what's happened in the last, number of months with the Trump administration, there is a deep fear. People are fearful, in this country at least, about doing anything because they see that the Trump administration does not spare state power to come after people. They're coming after judges. They're coming after prosecutors. They're coming after law firms. They're coming after lawful residents of the United States. They're sending people to Guantanamo Bay. They've created this fear, Jamal, that has paralyzed people from taking action. And I can, we could kind of see what's happening. It's only going to get worse. They're going to deport people, Jamal. And they're going to deport people irrespective of what the Supreme Court says. I mean, Trump doesn't care about the courts. This is a constitutional crisis that we're in. We're not headed toward one. We are in one. And I think there's just a lot more fear right now, which is paralyzing people to do anything.
So moving on to our last story, Jess, everyone knows now what's happening as far as the economy in this country and the spending cuts across government programs. The DOGE, Social Security is under scrutiny, the shutting down USAID and many other
the Department of Education
programs. The Department of Education is being shut down. So supposedly, this is the scheme that Musk came up with. He says that there is a lot of fat that you need to get rid of, a lot of fat, a lot of expenditures, a lot of fraud that we're going through, and this is going to help us basically reduce our debt and save us trillions of dollars and so forth. So you got all these spending cuts across government programs. But then you have Congress, and Congress has a say, which basically, they complain about this and complain about that, except one thing that keeps going. It is the money, the billions of dollars that keep going to Israel. It remains untouched, and not even untouched, yes.
Increased.
They've expanded those, I mean, this should be concern, right? This should be concern both for fiscal conservatives worried about unchecked government spending. That's what they keep. That's why they're supporting what they're doing. Trump, they keep saying the unchecked government spending, and then at the same time they are expanding. Like recently, the Congress passed a resolution authorizing the Department of Defense to transfer an additional $1.5 billion worth of U.S. weapons to Israel from the stockpile between 2027 and 2029. So this is kind of like you're drawing on your credit card. You're borrowing from the stockpile of 2 years from now, 2027 to 2029, to give it to Israel. At the same time, these lawmakers are preaching about austerity measures on domestic programs. What's going on?
Yeah, it's kind of a bit of surreality. Things are surreal right now, Jamal. People are talking out of both sides of their mouth. We're talking about Republicans and to some extent Democrats. I think we need to really make it clear that with this increased expenditure of sending more military aid and weapons to Israel, it's not like the Democrats are standing up and saying, "Oh, please stop this." This is tragically a bipartisan effort. And what's going on is that this is basically the alliance between Israeli and American extremist interests. I mean, we're talking about the most extreme elements of the right wing, and the most extreme elements, of the Israeli super right wing, because the entire society is kind of right wingish, kind of aligning themselves in what they perceive as a strategic interest. So, of course, Jamal, we know this, that politicians are lying through their teeth. They're not going to save trillions of dollars. People are losing their jobs. The vets in the VA system who count on these benefits, especially like the mental health benefits, are seeing their ability to access care being severely limited. You even had one of Trump's financial advisors say, "Oh, if older people miss a Social Security check, they're not going to really care so much." I mean, really bizarre stuff. So to call this fiscal conservatism, of course, is a lie. This is an attempt to privatize everything within the federal government. Everything is headed toward that direction. They're going to have more, basically, tax breaks for the extremely wealthy people. And, this is what Bernie Sanders has been saying for a long time. It's an oligarchy, where basically billionaires are siphoning and taking ownership over all of the resources of our so-called democracy. And that's where it's headed, Jamal. And so just giving Israel more money is just part of that overall plan. And I'm really concerned that we're headed in a direction where the financial devastation that's going to be brought to Americans. I mean, it looks like we're headed toward a big recession, Jamal. And Trump and his acolytes really don't care about this. I mean, they're really hurting people, and they're hurting Trump voters. And Trump voters aren't even batting an eye with this. So it's headed toward very dark times.
I forgot to mention that additionally to this, Congress extended the $9 billion in loan guarantees to Israel through 2030, ensuring continued financial backing, basically, to this country at the time when they're making a big brouhaha, or at least the administration, about cancellation of student loans, which they stopped for students. So you have loan guarantees to a foreign country, $9 billion, but you don't have loan guarantees to students in this country.
No, they're going to, listen, Jamal, students are going to go to jail if they don't pay their student loans. They're going to start doing that, trust me. They're going to deport people who are lawful residents of this country, students who are lawful residents of this country, for not paying off their student loans. We are only barely touching the surface of this extremist, and there's no other way to say this, fascistic kind of basically white supremacist kind of attitude about how this country should be run. I think people need to really be prepared for this. I think, each week, because it's so much, he's flooding the zone with all these stuff. People aren't able to process how bad this is.
Well, it's true, but I've been seeing, and many people have seen in town hall meetings, these congressmen and congresswomen are not met with love. People are questioning because now they're getting hit in the pocket. It's a whole different story.
But is it changing anything in D.C.?
Yeah, but it's a whole different story to kind of shift the attention to target immigrants and target foreign countries and so forth. It's totally different than targeting people in the pocket. Targeting them by so many people who are going to be losing their employment. And also, we've been seeing what's happening in people's 401ks, with the jitters in the stock market, but also at the same time, businesses with these sanctions or tariffs, I would say, like, with Canada, cancellations, Canadians going to resorts in Florida and other places, small business owners. So I think eventually this is, maybe people don't care about what's happening in Gaza, but they should care about what's happening to their future in this country.
We can only hope, but I'm not optimistic about this, Jamal. I mean, looking at the trajectory of things, it has the picture of things getting much, 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 much worse and not getting better. And we don't see any kind of opposition. The Democrats are failing this country again. They failed and they got Donald Trump elected. They're not able to put up any kind of substantial defense. You have Chuck Schumer going along with the Trump plan to basically destroy democratic infrastructure within this country. I mean, I don't see anybody really standing up to this, and that's very disturbing.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.